To evaluate policies, we need to be able to know what the welfare of society is. So in order to say whether a policy is good or bad, we need to know whether it makes society better off or worse off. But what does that even mean? What does it mean to make society better off or worse off? We need some measure of how well off society is. So one measure of society's well-being is W, which is the sum of producer and consumer surpluses. So W represents the total gains to be had by allowing the market to operate. So this is the most gains that the producers and the consumers could together achieve by transacting. Now, this is one particular way of measuring welfare. And it treats everyone equally here. It's not saying anything particular about how these gains are distributed across the producers or the consumers. For example, one policy that leads to a producer surplus of 50 and a consumer surplus of 50 is considered, according to this measure of welfare, just as good as a policy that leads to 100 in producer surplus and 0 in consumer surplus. So this is just one particular way of measuring society's well-being, and all it's saying is it's really measuring the size of the pie. And it's saying the bigger the size of the pie, the bigger the gains from trade that are achieved, the better off society is. There are lots of other ways you can measure welfare, but this is one particular way of doing it. And when you hear the refrain that markets are efficient and markets maximize welfare, this is the notion of welfare that refers to. Graphically, what does this mean? If we look at the competitive equilibrium, we draw our supply curve and our demand curve, and we find the equilibrium point, then that equilibrium point is the point where consumer and producer surplus together are maximized. So the area under the demand curve and above the price, the area above the supply curve and below the price, if we add these up, they're going to be maximized at the competitive equilibrium. So the Q, the quantity Q, where supply equals demand, is where these are maximized. Let's look at this a little more carefully. So remember, when you have perfect competition, the price and quantity are going to be found by the competitive equilibrium, where the supply and demand curves cross. Now let's suppose for some reason that the quantity was held back. So it falls to Q2 rather than the equilibrium quantity Q1. And because of that, the price that the consumers are willing to pay is going to go up from P1 to P2. So we're going to be at this point on the demand curve. So what's the new consumer surplus? If the consumers are paying the price P2, then the new consumer surplus is going to be this area. If the suppliers are receiving this price P2, the producer surplus is, remember, the area above the supply curve, below the price. So their revenue is going to be this rectangle. Their marginal cost is going to be the area below the supply curve. So their surplus is this area. So the total welfare is only this area here. It used to be this whole triangle, but now it's less than the whole triangle. In particular, we've lost this area here. So there's a reduction in the total welfare. So think about what's happening here for unit number Q2 plus 1. For that particular unit, the consumers are willing to pay this much, a tiny bit less than P2, and the producers are willing to supply it at this price down here. So the consumers value it this much more than what the producers are willing to supply it at. So the value that's generated for the consumers is greater than the cost of producing it. And that value is lost by having Q2 be too low. And that's true for every unit between Q2 and Q1. We call this the deadweight loss. The loss from not consuming the right amount of the good is the deadweight loss. So in this case, it's the welfare loss from consuming too few units of the good. What if you produce too much? So for some reason, the supply is too high. So when I say some reason, let's suppose there's some policy that causes the supply to be too high. So let's think about what happens if we move from the equilibrium scenario P1, Q1 to this scenario where the quantity jumps to Q2, and so the consumers are only willing to pay P2. The producer surplus used to be this area. After the increase in the quantity and the decrease to the price, the producer surplus is going to change. What is the cost of producing Q2 units? This is the variable cost. So this is going to be the variable cost. And what is the amount that they're going to receive as revenue? It's going to be this area here. They used to get this area as producer surplus. They're going to lose that. This portion of their variable cost they're going to recover, but this portion of their variable cost they're not going to recover via revenue. So the loss of producer surplus is actually going to be this entire area. What's the change in consumer surplus? Well, the consumers are consuming more and paying less for it. So they're unambiguously better off. So the gain in consumer surplus is going to be this area here. Why? Because the consumer surplus used to be this triangle up here, and after the change, the consumer surplus is going to be this bigger triangle. The difference is this shaded area. So that's the gain in consumer surplus. So what's the deadweight loss? Remember, the producers are losing this much. This is what the producers are losing. The consumers are gaining this part. So the consumers are recovering part of the loss suffered by the suppliers, but not all of it. Particularly, this portion here does not get recovered, and that's the deadweight loss. So perfect competition maximizes welfare, and this is essentially a key feature of the price mechanism. So the invisible hand of the market adjusts the price just until price equals marginal cost. If the price is too high, so if the price is higher than the marginal cost, then the consumers are willing to pay more than it costs the firms to produce one more unit. And so you should be producing more output. If the price is too low, what that reflects is that the value of the good is lower to the consumer than what it costs the firms to produce. So it doesn't actually make sense societally for these goods to be produced. So the firms should reduce their output. The difference between the price that the consumers pay and the marginal cost is called a wedge. And at the competitive equilibrium in a market, the wedge is zero. So price and marginal cost are the same. And that's why the competitive equilibrium outcome is socially efficient. It maximizes W, the measure of social welfare.